The dismissal was a quiet, gray affair, conducted in a hallway that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool. Clara Thorne stood with her hands clasped, her worn gloves hiding the ink stains on her fingertips, a testament to the ledgers she had just balanced for the fifth and final time. Lady Albright, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched by the scent of her own virtue, did not look at her. Her gaze was fixed on a point somewhere over Clara's left shoulder, as if addressing a mildly disappointing smudge on the wallpaper. It is simply not suitable, Miss Thorne," she said, her voice thin as a winter twig. My girls require a governess of unimpeachable reputation. The whispers they persist. The whispers. They had followed Clara from London like a stray dog. She could not shake. Whispers about her father, Professor Thorne, a man who had once been celebrated for his mind, and was now remembered only for his debts. A man who had loved ancient documents more than sound investments, and who had left his only daughter with a legacy of his good name, thoroughly tarnished, and the skills he had taught her, a peculiar knowledge of paper watermarks, ink compositions, and the elegant damning logic of a well-kept account book. Useless skills, for a woman seeking respectable employment. I assure you, my lady, my work has been exemplary, Clara said, her own voice low and steady. It was a voice she had cultivated, one that gave nothing away, that did not plead or waver. It was the auditory equivalent of a high stone wall. Exemplary is not the word I would choose, a Lady Albright sniffed, her eyes finally flicking down to Clara's worn but meticulously repaired boots. A sufficient, perhaps. But the association, one cannot be too careful. The crime was not that her father had lost his money. The crime was that he had died before he could make it back, leaving the shame of his failure exposed for all to see. And Clara, by extension, wore that shame like a second shawl. She did not argue. Arguing required a belief that the other party was interested in reason, and Lady Albright was interested only in distancing herself from the faintest whiff of social inconvenience. Clara inclined her head. As you wish, my lady. I will gather my things, things fit into a single scuffed valise back in her small, cold room at the top of the house. She packed with an efficiency born of practice. The few plain dresses, the mending kit, the single volume of her father's essays that she had managed to save from the creditors. She worked without haste, her movements precise. To rush would be to admit panic, and panic was a luxury she had long ago learned she could not afford. The whispers followed her down the stairs. Two housemaids, their arms full of linen, fell silent as she passed, their eyes wide and curious. They were not unkind, but she was a spectacle, the disgraced governess, cast out. She felt their pity like a physical weight, heavier than her valise. Outside, a damp, clinging November mist shrouded the London square. It seeped into the gray stone of the houses, blurring their edges, making the world feel uncertain and provisional. Clara stood on the bottom step, the heavy front door closing behind her, with a sound of finality, like a vault being sealed. She had 2 shillings and a few pennies in her purse. Enough for a room in a cheap boarding house for a few nights. Not enough for hope. She started walking, not toward any particular destination, but simply away from the house where she had been deemed unsuitable. The mist curled around her ankles. She thought of her father as hands, long-fingered and gentle, showing her how to hold a fragile piece of vellum up to the light. A look for the story the paper tells, Clara, he used to say. A task often more honest than the one written on it. Her father had taught her to read the secrets of the past. But he had left her utterly unprepared for the brutal mathematics of the present. Her lodging was a narrow room in a house that seemed to be held together by the smell of stale beer and despair. Her landlady, a woman with a perpetually suspicious expression, had taken her money with a grunt. Clara sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, the single valise at her feet. The window looked out onto a brick wall. There was nowhere to go. No one to write to. The last of her father's respectable friends had faded away with the last of his money. She was 27 years old, the daughter of a disgraced scholar, and possessed of a set of skills the world had decided were worthless. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and damp. She would not cry. Tears were a waste of precious water and salt. She would think. She would make a plan. Tomorrow she would start again. She would find another position, a less particular household, perhaps a merchanta's family. Somewhere, the whispers from Mayfair could not reach. But as the chill of the room sank into her bones, a different thought, a colder one, surfaced. What if there were no more positions? What if the whispers had finally grown loud enough to drown out any chance she had? For the first time, a tremor of true fear ran through her. It was sharp and cold as a shard of ice against her heart. She wrapped her arms around herself, not for warmth, but to hold herself together. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of her own steady, controlled breathing. The summons arrived 2 days later, delivered by a boy who seemed more intimidated by the boarding house than by the impressive crest on the envelope he carried. It was not an offer of employment. It was a command. The Duke of Blackmore requests your presence at his London residence, 4:00. There was no explanation, no preamble. Clara stared at the heavy cream paper, the black ink, stark and authoritative. Blackmore. She knew the name. Of course, everyone did. A title as old as the stones of the tower, a man spoken of in hushed, contradictory tones. A recluse, a tyrant, a widower, his heart frozen in the same moment his young duchess had died. Nathaniel, Duke of Blackmore, a man of immense power, and if the gossip columns were to be believed, immense sorrow. What could such a man possibly want with her? Her first instinct was to dismiss it as a mistake, a cruel joke. But the address was correct. Her name, Miss Clara Thorne, was written in a clerk's impeccable hand. A new kind of fear, mingled with a faint, dangerous spark of curiosity, took hold. The Duke of Blackmore did not request the presence of penniless, disgraced governesses. It made no sense. Unless it had something to do with her father. Had he, in his desperate final years, become entangled with the Duke? A debt? A forgotten transaction? The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. She had nothing to wear but the gray dress she had been dismissed in. She sponged it carefully, pressed the collar and cuffs, using a heated stone wrapped in cloth, and pinned her hair with ruthless severity. She would not look like a supplicant. She would look like what she was, a woman of education and resolve, temporarily at a disadvantage. At 4:15, she stepped out into the London gloom. She would walk. A cab was an extravagance she could not afford, and arriving early would signal an unseemly eagerness. Punctuality was a statement of control. It was the only statement she had left to make. The Duca's London residence was a fortress of pale stone on a quiet square, its windows dark and unblinking. It did not look like a home. It looked like a mausoleum. A severe, black-clad butler opened the door before she had touched the knocker, his face a mask of polite indifference. He did not seem surprised to see her, a Miss Thorne. "His Grace is expecting you." Awed, she was led not to a drawing-room or a parlor, but to a library. The room was vast, its walls lined with books from floor to ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of leather, paper, and something else, a profound, settled silence, as if no one had raised their voice in here for a very long time. A low fire guttered in the hearth, throwing more shadows than light. And in the center of the room, standing before the fire with his back to her, was the Duke. He was taller than she had expected, his frame lean but broad-shouldered. He did not turn as she entered. The butler melted away, closing the doors behind him with a soft, final click. The silence descended again, heavier this time, charged with expectation. Clara waited. She did not cough or shift her feet. She had learned long ago that in rooms dominated by powerful men, the first person to speak often lost. She planted her feet on the rich Turkish carpet and held her ground. He noticed the stillness. He noticed the lack of any sound of fidgeting, of a nervous breath drawn. He noticed the way the silence she brought into the room was not an absence, but a presence calm, contained, and unnervingly steady. He had expected a frightened mouse. This was something else entirely. Finally, he turned. The gossip columns had not done him justice. They spoke of his coldness, but they hadn't captured the sheer stillness of his grief. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, his eyes a startling pale gray, the color of a winter sky. They were eyes that looked as if they had seen too much and felt too little for a very long time. There was no warmth in them. No welcome, only a deep, weary assessment. Miss Thorne," he said. His voice was a low baritone, devoid of inflection. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock that had not been used for years. Your Grace," she replied, inclining her head just so. He gestured to a single, hard-backed chair placed in the center of the room, far from the fire's meager warmth. An interrogation chair. She met his gaze and walked to it, sitting with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. He did not sit. He remained standing by the fire, a formidable silhouette against the flames. You are the daughter of Professor Alistair Thorne. It was not a question I am. He was an expert in historical documents and paleography. He taught USC. Again, a statement. He had done his research. This was not about some forgotten debt. This was about her. My father believed a broad education was essential. Your Grace. Even for a daughter, a flicker of her father's dry pride surfaced in her tone before she could suppress it. A muscle tightened in the Duke's jaw. He had noticed that too. He died in disgrace. Debt. Scandal. The words were brutal, laid out like surgical instruments. Clara felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice perfectly even. My father's financial failings do not alter the quality of his scholarship or his teaching. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. A flicker of not respect, perhaps, but something close to it. Surprise. He had expected her to flinch, to apologize for her father's name. She had defended it. I have a son, the Duke said, abruptly changing the subject. His name is Arthur. He is 7 years old. His mother, the Duchess, died a year ago. He spoke the words as if reading from a ledger. Does not speak. Not in any meaningful way. I have employed 4 governesses in the past 10 months. The longest lasted 6 weeks. They found the silenza unsettling, or my sister presence intolerable. He paused, his gray eyes fixed on her face, searching for a reaction. Clara gave him none. She simply listened. My estate, Blackmore, is in the north. It is remote. It is where my son resides. I require a governess to go there, immediately. Here it was, the proposition. But it still didn't make sense. There were 100 governesses in London with impeccable references and sunny dispositions. Why her? Why me? Your Grace, she asked, the question direct and unadorned. Because you are not a simpering debutante looking for a title. Because you have nothing to lose and are therefore less likely to be frightened off. And because I have a second, more pressing problem, for which your peculiar education may be useful. He moved from the fire, picking up a thin folder from the massive desk. My estate is not what it once was. Miss Thorne, there are debts, complications. My late wife's trustees are concerned about my son's upbringing, about the stability of the household. He opened the folder. It contained a single sheet of paper. They have given me a deadline. I have until the 1st of April to demonstrate that Blackmore is a stable, well-managed home for my heir. If I fail, they will petition to have my son made a ward of the court, to be raised by his maternal uncle. The unspoken threat hung in the air. He would lose his son. The governesses flee, he continued, his voice flat. The household is in disarray. My sister, Lady Augusta, believes she is helping, but her grief makes her difficult. The accounts are a mess. I need someone to bring order to the chaos. Not just in the nursery, but in the house itself. He looked directly at her. I need a governess who can also read a ledger. I am offering you the position of household manager, with the duties of a governess included. It was an absurd, unheard of role. A gentlewoman hired to be half servant, half overseer. An insult wrapped in a lifeline. The position is temporary, he stated, his voice turning to ice. It lasts until the spring, until the trustees are satisfied. Then your employment will be terminated, with a generous severance. You will have enough to live comfortably for several years, to go wherever you wish. He was buying her skills, her resilience, her desperation. For a fixed term, she would be a tool, used to solve his problem and then discarded. She should have been insulted. She should have been angry, but all she felt was the cold, hard reality of her situation. 2 shillings in her purse, a brick wall outside her window. This man was offering her survival. He saw the calculation in her eyes. Well, Miss Thorne, do you accept? Clara looked at the Duke, at his cold, handsome face, at the profound loneliness that clung to him like the November mist. He was a man trapped in his own fortress, and he was asking her to help him defend it. She thought of the line of governesses who had fled. She thought of his difficult sister. She thought of the silent, grieving boy. She would not be the fifth to fail. She rose from the chair, her small stature suddenly possessing an unexpected authority. Before I answer, Your Grace, you will tell me the truth, all of it. I do not bargain with half a story. Nathania's eyebrows shot up. No one spoke to him like that. No one. He had expected gratitude or at the very least, timid acceptance. He got a demand. The truth, he repeated, a dangerous edge to his voice. You said the accounts are a mess, Clara pressed on, her heart hammering against her ribs but her voice unwavering. Is it simple mismanagement, or do you suspect something else? He stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching taut. He saw no guile in her face, only a fierce, unblinking intelligence. She was not asking to pry, she was asking to understand the nature of the battlefield she was being sent to. He made a decision. I suspect fraud, he said, the words low and sharp. My father-in-law. Lord Grantham was a meticulous man. The estate should be solvent, prosperous even, yet money bleeds from it. Leases that make no sense. Debts to creditors I have never heard of. I need a fresh pair of eyes. Someone outside the household. Someone no one would ever suspect of having the skill to see it. He looked her up and down. Someone like you. The pieces clicked into place. He wasn't just hiring a governess. He was hiring a spy. A quiet, overlooked woman who could move through his house unnoticed, balancing the books in more ways than one. Her father's disgrace, her lack of connection, they were not liabilities. They were qualifications, self-sufficient. The word for a horse that does not need to be fed. A strange, bitter strength filled her. He had chosen her for her weaknesses, but she would answer him with her strengths. Will accept the position, she said. But I have conditions. Nathaniel almost smiled. It was a faint, grim twisting of his lips. But it was a change. Conditions, he echoed, as if tasting a foreign word. First, Clara stated, I will have complete authority over the nursery and the household staff. My decisions are final. If your sister wishes to countermand an order, she must come to you, and you will support me. He nodded slowly, agreed. A second, I am to have unrestricted access to all household and estate ledgers, correspondence, and legal documents, dating back 5 years. No questions asked. Agreed. A third, she said, her voice softening slightly. The memory of the late Duchess is to be respected. I will not be asked to replace her, nor will I tolerate any attempt to erase her presence. For the comfort of the living, a child cannot heal if he is forced to forget this time. He was the one who was silenced. He stared at her, and for a fleeting second, the mask of cold indifference slipped. She saw a flicker of raw, aching pain in his eyes. He had expected her to be a functionary, a solution to a problem. He had not expected her to understand the shape of his grief, or his sonas. He had not expected her to be kind. He began, his voice rough. That condition is also agreed. He cleared his throat, the mask sliding back into place. Is that all? One more thing, Clara said, meeting his gaze directly. I am not your servant, Your Grace. I will be your employee. I will perform the duties you have outlined. But I will not be treated as a piece of furniture to be ignored until needed. I will take my meals, if not with you, then in my own sitting room. I will not be relegated to the governess's table in a servants' hall. It was a bold, outrageous demand, a demand for dignity. She expected him to refuse, to dismiss her on the spot. Instead, he gave a short, sharp nod. Done. You will have a sitting room adjoining the nursery. It will be prepared. He walked back to his desk and pulled a heavy leather purse from a drawer. He did not count the coins, but simply pushed it across the polished surface toward her. For your travel and any immediate necessities. A carriage will be ready to take you to Blackmore tomorrow morning, at 8. He turned away from her, then moving to stare back into the fire. It was a dismissal. The transaction was complete. Clara took the purse. It was heavy. She did not thank him. Gratitude was not part of their bargain. She walked to the door, her steps silent on the thick carpet. With her hand on the brass handle, she paused. Your Grace. He did not turn. Yes, I will not fail you. He said nothing. The only sound was the crackle of the fire, eating away at the silence in the vast, lonely room. Outside, the mist had turned to a fine, cold drizzle. Clara walked back to her boarding house, the weight of the purse and her reticule a solid, comforting presence. She had a purpose. She had a destination. She had a deadline. Spring. That night, in the Duca's library, long after Clara was gone, Nathaniel stood before the portrait of his late wife. It was a beautiful painting, full of light and life, a cruel counterpoint to the gloom of the house. I found someone, Eleanor, he whispered to the smiling face on the canvas. A chaise, not like the others. A fortress. I don't think Augusta will be able to break her. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound weariness. I hope I have done the right thing. For Arthur, for us. He thought of Clara Thorne's clear, steady eyes. He thought of her impossible demands, spoken with the courage of a woman who had already lost everything and was therefore afraid of nothing. He had told her she was useful. But the truth, the unsettling and unexpected truth, was that for the first time in a year, he felt a flicker of something he had thought long dead. It was not hope. It was something far more dangerous. It was intrigue. The next morning, as the city was still shrouded in gray dawn, Clara stood by the carriage. The Duca's butler handed her a thick, fur-lined traveling cloak. His Grace's compliments, he said, his expression unreadable. Clara touched the soft fur. It was an unexpected kindness, a crack in the cold facade of their transaction. She climbed into the carriage without a word, the door closing with a solid thud. As the carriage lurched into motion, heading north, she looked out the window at the sleeping city. She was leaving one prison for another, but this one, at least, came with a purpose and a deadline. The journey north was long, the landscape changing from the crowded gray of the city to rolling hills, then to the stark, wind-swept beauty of the moors. Blackmore appeared suddenly, a jagged silhouette of dark stone against a bruised purple sky. It was not a house. It was a geological feature, a place that had risen from the earth rather than been built upon it. It stood on a rise dominating the landscape, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the unforgiving terrain. The wind howled around its turrets, a constant mournful sound. The carriage rolled to a stop in a vast, cobbled courtyard. The air was bitingly cold, As Clara stepped down, a woman emerged from the massive front doors. She was tall and slender, dressed in severe black silk, her pale blonde hair twisted into an elaborate knot. Though she was beautiful, her face was drawn tight with a mixture of grief and suspicion. This had to be Lady Augusta. "Ah, so," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "Ah, you are the latest one." She did not offer a greeting or a hand. She simply looked Clara up and down, her gaze lingering on the plain gray dress. You are not what I expected." And what did you expect, my lady?" Clara asked, her voice calm. Someone with a references." Augusta replied with a thin, cruel smile. My brother has developed a penchant for strays, it seems. Do not bother to unpack everything. You won't be staying long." It was a declaration of war. Clara met her gaze without flinching. His Grace has employed me until the spring. I intend to honor my contract. We shall see," Augusta said, turning on her heel. Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, will show you to your rooms. Do try not to upset the boy. He has suffered enough." With that, she swept back into the house, leaving Clara alone in the wind-swept courtyard. So this was the cold house. A small round woman with kind, worried eyes bustled forward. This was Mr. Davies, a Miss Thorne. "Welcome to Blackmore. Please, come inside out of the cold." Her warmth was a small welcome flame in the oppressive chill of the place. The inside of Blackmore was even more daunting than the outside. A great hall, with a ceiling lost in shadows, a stone floor that echoed with every footstep, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors watching from the walls. A fine layer of dust covered everything, and the air was frigid, as if the fires had not been properly lit in a year. The house itself seemed to be in mourning. Clara's rooms were in a wing, overlooking a walled garden, now brown and skeletal in the late autumn light. There was a small, functional bedroom and an adjoining sitting room, just as the Duke had promised. A fire had been lit in the sitting room hearth, but it struggled against the chill seeping from the stone walls. "His little lordship's rooms are just there," Mrs. Davies said, pointing to a connecting door. Hey, he keeps to himself, miss, mostly. He's a good boy, just a quiet." Her voice was full of a sad, helpless affection. Thank you, Davies," Clara said. Could you have my valise brought up, and I would like to see the household account books, all of them." The housekeeper's eyes widened. "The accounts, Miss Chi." "Lady Augusta, His Grace has given me full authority," Clara stated, her voice gentle but firm. "Please have them brought here." Mrs. Davies nodded, a flicker of something of respect, perhaps in her eyes. "Yes, miss." Right away, left alone, Clara walked to the window. The wind was a living thing, pressing against the glass. This was her new world, a silent child, a hostile sister-in-law, a house full of secrets, and a duke who watched from a distance, waiting for her to fail. She heard the line again, whispered by the maids at Lady Albrida's, a piece of gossip they must have picked up from the Duca's own staff. "Shall be gone by spring." Clara smoothed the gray fabric of her dress. We shall see," she whispered to her reflection in the dark glass. Her first meeting with Arthur was not a meeting at all. She opened the connecting door to his rooms quietly. The nursery was a large, cold room, filled with expensive but unloved toys. At the far end, by a tall window, the boy was sitting on the floor. He was small for his age, with dark hair like his father's, and a pale, serious face. He was not playing. He was simply staring out the window, his back to the room, a small, carved wooden bird clutched in his hand. Clara did not speak his name. She did not rush toward him with false cheerfulness, as she suspected the other governesses had. She simply stood in the doorway for a moment, then walked over to the heavy velvet curtains that were drawn half shut, plunging the room into gloom. With a quiet scrape of brass rings on a wooden pole, she pulled them wide open. Sunlight, pale and watery though it was, flooded the room. The boy flinched at the sudden brightness, He turned his head, his father's pale gray eyes, widening in surprise. He looked at her, then at the light pouring in, then back at her. He said nothing. Clara gave him a small, brief nod, as if they were two adults, acknowledging each other across a crowded room. Then she turned and left, closing the door softly behind her. She would not force his trust. She would earn it one sliver of sunlight at a time. That evening, Mrs. Sexture Davies delivered a towering stack of leather-bound ledgers. A from the estate office. Miss. Everything from the last 5 years. As you asked. Clara spent the night at the small desk in her sitting room, a single candle, her only companion. She opened the first book. The methodical neatness of the columns, the crisp certainty of the numbers, was a comfort. This was a language she understood. She worked for hours, her father's lessons coming back to her. Look for the patterns, Clara. And then, look for the breaks in the pattern. That is where the truth hides. She did not find anything immediately incriminating, but she found oddities. Payments made to a shipping company in Liverpool. Though Blackmore was landlocked and produced nothing for export, leases for grazing lands in a county miles away, at exorbitant rates. Small things easily overlooked on their own, but together they felt like a trail of breadcrumbs leading into a dark wood. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Clara looked up, her senses on high alert. She blew out the candle and sat in the darkness, her heart beating a little faster. She listened. The footsteps were heavy, measured. They stopped outside her door. She held her breath. The footsteps moved on, receding down the long, cold corridor. It was the Duke. He must have returned from London. She realized with a jolt that he had been checking on her. Watching. She relit the candle, her hand trembling slightly. She was not just an employee. She was a piece on his chessboard, and he was watching her, every move. The thought was both unnerving and, in a strange way, steadying. He was paying attention. The days at Blackmore fell into a quiet, tense routine. In the mornings, Clara would go into the nursery. Arthur would be in his usual spot by the window. She would not try to engage him in lessons. Instead, she would simply occupy the space with him. She brought a book from the library and read quietly to herself. She took out a box of her father's old cartography pens and a fresh sheet of paper and began to draw a map of the Blackmore estate from memory, her strokes fine and precise. Arthur watched her. She could feel his gaze on her, curious and wary. He never spoke, but sometimes when she looked up, she would find him looking at her drawings, his head tilted. Lady Augusta was a constant, chilling presence. She would appear in doorways, her arms crossed, a silent, disapproving spectator. She made cutting remarks at the dinner table, where Clara now sat, a silent testament to the conditions she had set. The Duke was rarely present, taking his meals in his study. Augusta directed her venom at Clara instead. "I see you are encouraging the boyish idleness, Miss Thorne," she said. One evening, her voice sharp. Staring out of windows is not an education." He is not idle, my lady," Clara replied calmly, not looking up from her plate. He is observing. There is a difference. A difference. Only a disgraced scholar's daughter would appreciate, I suppose." The insult was meant to draw blood. Clara simply placed her knife and fork together. My father taught me that the most important discoveries are made through quiet observation. I am applying his methods. She met Augusta's furious gaze, with his Grace's full approval. She had used the Duca's authority as a shield, and Augusta fell silent, her lips a thin, white line. It was a small victory, but in the Cold War of Blackmore, it felt significant. Nathaniel heard about the exchange from a footman. He stood in his dark study, swirling the brandy in his glass, and a slow, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. He had hired a fortress, and she was holding the line. He found himself thinking of her not as Miss Thorne, the temporary solution, but as Clara. The name felt strange on his thoughts, intimate and unsettling. He had told his staff she would be gone by spring. He had said it with the weary certainty of a man who had seen everyone leave. But as the first snows of winter began to fall, dusting the moors in a sheet of white, he found himself, for the first time, wondering if he had been wrong. The breakthrough with Arthur came, not with a word, but with a book. Clara had discovered a section of the library devoted to naval history and exploration. The books were old, their pages filled with detailed maps of distant seas and drawings of magnificent sailing ships. She brought one of the largest volumes to the nursery one afternoon. She did not offer it to Arthur, but simply opened it on a low table near where he sat, the grand, colorful map of the Pacific Ocean, spread out like a promise of another world. She went back to her own reading, pretending to pay him no mind. For an hour, there was only silence. Then, she heard a soft rustle of movement. She glanced up from under her lashes. Arthur had left his post at the window. He was on his knees, by the table, his small hands hovering just over the surface of the map, tracing the lines of the trade winds. His face, usually so blank and distant, was alive with concentration. Claire's heart gave a painful lurch. She stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. He leaned closer, his finger touching a tiny cluster of islands in the vast blue. And then, he spoke. His voice was a small rusty whisper, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. The Marchesa Clara looked at him, her throat tight. He was looking at the map, not at her, but he had spoken. He had shared a piece of his hidden world with her. Yes, she said, her own voice quiet, matching his, the Marquesas Islands. Captain Cook stopped there, on his second voyage. Arthur looked up at her then, his pale gray eyes wide with a question. He wanted to know more. It was the beginning. From that day on, the nursery was no longer silent. It was filled with the whispered names of constellations, the routes of explorers, the parts of a three-masted schooner. Arthur's words were hesitant at first, but they grew stronger each day. He was not a silent boy. He was a boy with a mind full of oceans and stars, who had simply been waiting for someone to give him a map. One evening, as Clara was showing him how to use a compass, he reached out and touched the sleeve of her dress. You stay, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact and a plea. Yes, Arthur, she said, her hand covering his. I stay. At the same time, the secrets of the ledgers were beginning to yield. Clara had found it, the pattern. A series of payments, all signed off by the estate's long-standing solicitor, a Mr. Finch, a man Lady Augusta trusted implicitly. They were for the purchase of land from an entity called the A Northern Holdings Company. But when Clara cross-referenced them with the estate maps, she found that Blackmore already owned those lands. The estate was paying to buy property it already possessed. It was a simple, audacious fraud hidden in plain sight. She took her findings to the Duke. She laid the ledgers out on the massive table in his study, her fingers tracing the damning columns of figures. He listened in silence, his expression grim, his jaw tight. A Finch, he said. The name a curse. He has been my family's solicitor for 30 years. My father trusted him. Lady Augusta trusts him, Clara added quietly. Nathaniel looked at her, his gaze sharp. She confides in him, about the estate, about everything. The implication was ugly. Augusta, in her grief-stricken and misguided attempt to protect the family, was likely feeding information to the very man who was bleeding it dry. He is using her grief against her, Clara said. She believes she is honoring the Duchess's memory by preserving the old ways, the old advisors. Finch is exploiting that loyalty. Nathaniel paced the room, his controlled facade cracking. He was no longer the cold, distant Duke. He was a man watching his family's legacy being stolen from under him, his own sister, a pawn in the game. Hired you to be a governess, he said, stopping in front of her. To manage a household. You hired me to find the truth. She corrected him softly. He looked at her then, truly looked at her intelligent, steady eyes, her calm face, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her. She had given him back his Suna's voice. And now she was giving him the weapons he needed to save his home. The distance between them, the formal space of employer and employee, seemed to dissolve in the flickering candlelight. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the scent of old paper and soap that clung to her, of the way the firelight caught the soft brown of her hair. He had built walls around his heart so high he had thought them impenetrable. She had not tried to scale them, she had simply walked through a door he had forgotten was unlocked. Clara, he said, the name finally spoken aloud. It felt right. A thank you, eh? The quiet words were more powerful than any grand declaration. They were an admission of need, of reliance. They were the sound of his own walls beginning to crumble. The thaw had reached the master of the house, but as warmth began to creep into the cold corners of Blackmore, the serpent in the garden began to stir. Lady Augusta, seeing Clara's growing influence, with both her brother and her nephew, felt her own position threatened. She saw the late-night conferences in the study, the shared smiles between Clara and Arthur. She saw a usurper, an adventuress, worming her way into the heart of the family, and she went to the one person she trusted to give her counsel, Mr. Finch. The solicitor listened to her frantic whispered fears with a show of grave sympathy. He patted her hand, his face a mask of concern. My dear Lady Augusta," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "your instincts are, as always, impeccable. This Miss Thorna, I have made some inquiries. The daughter of a charlatan and a bankrupt, she is clearly after the Blackmore fortune. These a discrepancia she claims to have found in the books of fabrication, a smokescreen to cover her own embezzling, no doubt. She is trying to discredit me, to isolate you, to gain control over your brother. He let the poison sink in. We must act, he continued, his voice urgent. For the boy's sake, the trustees must be alerted. They must see how the Duke is being manipulated. They must intervene before this woman ruins you all. Augusta, blinded by her grief and her pride, saw only a loyal friend trying to help her save her family. She did not see the glint of triumph in his eyes. A week later, a formal letter arrived from the trustees. An emergency hearing had been convened, to be held at Blackmore in 2 weeks' time. The subject, a petition filed by Lady Augusta, citing the Duke's gross mismanagement, the unstable influence of a woman of low character, and the potential endangerment of his Suna's welfare and inheritance. The threat was no longer a shadow, it had taken form. Nathaniel read the letter, his face turning to stone. He found Clara in the nursery, reading to Arthur by the fire. The scene was so peaceful, so domestic, it was like a knife to the heart. This was what was at stake. He handed her the letter without a word. She read it, her expression remaining calm, but he saw her knuckles turn white where she gripped the paper. She looked up at him, her eyes dark with a new shared gravity. She is not a monster, you know, Clara said quietly. She is a woman who loved your wife, and who believes she is protecting your son. Finch is twisting that love into a weapon. Her lack of anger, her immediate clear-eyed analysis of his sister's motives stunned him. Even now, facing ruin and disgrace, her first instinct was to understand. And it doesn't matter what her motives are, he said, his voice harsh with a pain he couldn't hide. She has given him the power to destroy us. They will take Arthur away from me. He began to pace, the controlled Duke gone, replaced by a desperate father. I should have seen it. I let my pride, my grief, I closed myself off in this damned study and let the wolves into my house. He stopped in front of her, his hands clenched into fists. She will tear you apart at that hearing, Clara. She will use your father, your poverty. She will paint you as a villain, an adventuress. Let her. Clara said, her voice a sudden sharp note of steel. I am not afraid of the truth. He stared at her, at the fire in her eyes, the unshakable core of her. In that moment he knew. He knew that the bargain he had made, the cold, calculated transaction, had become something else entirely. He had hired her to save his house. He had not expected to find that, in the process, she had saved him. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them, wanting to touch her, to draw strength from her impossible calm. "I will not let them harm you," he vowed, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "We will not let them harm Arthur," she corrected him gently. He dropped his hand, a raw, painful understanding dawning on his face. He had been thinking of her, she was thinking of his son, her loyalty, her goodness. It was a thing of such purity, it almost broke him. Later that night, he confronted his sister. He found her in the drawing room, clutching a silver-framed miniature of the late Duchess. "Ah, what have you done, Augusta?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. "Ah, I have done what I had to do," she cried, her composure finally shattering. "Ah, to protect Eleanor's son from that. She has bewitched you. Nathaniel, can it? You see it? She's a fortune hunter. A nothing, a nothing, has given your nephew his voice. Bacca," he shot back, his control snapping. A nothing has shown more kindness and intelligence in 2 months than this house has seen in a year. She is more of a lady in her worn gray dress than you are in all your silks and outrage," Augusta gasped, her hand flying to her throat. How dare you?" I dare, because the safety of my son is at stake," he thundered. "And you, in your blind, selfish grief, have put him in the hands of a thief. Finch is the one bleeding this estate dry, not her Eliza," she shrieked. She has poisoned you against him." "Against me." He looked at his sister, at the woman he had grown up with, now a stranger, with a face twisted by suspicion and pain. It was hopeless. She was too far gone, too deep, in Finch's web. He took a deep breath, the anger draining out of him, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. "I will fight you, Augusta. I will fight Finch, and I will protect her. I would rather lose this entire estate than lose her Acha." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Augusta standing alone, the words hanging in the air between them. A declaration of allegiance, born of anger and fear. He had drawn his line in the sand. Clara was on his side. Everyone else was on the other. The day of the hearing dawned cold and gray. The trustees, 3 stern-faced elderly men, assembled in the great dining room. Lord Grantham, Arthur's maternal grandfather, was among them, his face a mask of grim neutrality. Mr. Finch, looking sleek and confident, sat beside a pale but resolute Lady Augusta. Clara and Nathaniel sat opposite them. The room was a battlefield, the long polished table a no-man's land. Arthur had been sent to the kitchens with Mrs. Davies, with strict instructions to keep him occupied, but Clara knew the boy was aware. He had clung to her hand that morning, his gray eyes huge with worry. You will stay," he had whispered. "A promise. I promise," she had said. A promise she was no longer sure she could keep. The hearing began. Lord Grantham, as head of the trustees, conducted the proceedings. Lady Augusta was the first to speak. Her voice, trembling with what she believed was righteous indignation, painted a damning picture. She spoke of Clara's mysterious arrival, her questionable background, her immediate seizure of control over the household. She spoke of the Duca's strange moods, his reclusiveness, his complete capitulation to the will of an employee. She has isolated him," Augusta declared, her eyes flashing. She has turned him against his own family. And she has filled his head with these poisonous lies about Mr. Finch, a man who has served our family with unimpeachable loyalty for decades. I fear for my nephew's safety. I fear for his inheritance." It was a masterful performance. Clara could feel the mood in the room shifting, the trustee expressions growing colder, more concerned. Then, Mr. Finch presented his case. He laid out his own set of ledgers, a beautiful work of fiction, showing a perfectly balanced and solvent estate. He then produced a second set of books. "These, my lords," he said, his voice resonating with false sincerity, "are the ledgers Miss Thorne has been keeping. As you can see, they are filled with fantastical entries, fabricated debts and withdrawals, small amounts at first but growing larger. Sums paid out to a holding company in London that, upon investigation, is registered to a post box. A post box rented, I am sorry to say, under a false name that we have traced back to an associate of her late, disgraced father. A collective gasp went through the room. It was a brilliant, vicious lie. He was framing her, using her own father's history to make it believable. Nathaniel surged to his feet. This is an outrage. A lie. Please, your grace, Lord Grantham said, his voice heavy. You will have your turn. Finch smiled, a small triumphant smirk. He had them. He had won. Finally, it was Clara's turn to speak. She rose, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked small and vulnerable in her plain dress, facing a room full of powerful men who had already judged her. My lords," she began, her voice quiet but clear, carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I will not waste your time refuting accusations against my character. My character is not what is at stake here. The future of this house, and of the boy who is its heir, is a she." Did not look at her own ledgers. She walked toward the table, where Finch's meticulously forged documents lay. Mr. Finch is a master of his craft. His numbers are perfect. His stories are believable. His crime is almost a work of art. She picked up one of his ledgers, the one detailing the fictitious land purchases. He has been selling Blackmore's own land back to itself, and pocketing the proceeds, a simple, elegant fraud. To cover it, he has created this narrative, casting me as the villain. Finch scoffed. Finch scoffed. The ravings of a desperate woman. Can you prove any of this, No, Clara said simply. The trustees shifted uncomfortably. Augusta looked triumphant. I cannot, because his forgeries are too good. The numbers will always match. The paper trail he has created for me is impeccable. She paused, letting the weight of her apparent defeat settle in the room. But my father, she continued, her voice gaining a new strength, taught me to look, not just at what is written on the page, but at the page itself. He taught me that every piece of paper tells its own story. She held up a single sheet from Finch's ledger, a bill of sale dated 3 years prior. See, Mr. Finch, you are a student of the law. I am a student of history. And you have made a historian's error. She walked over to the tall windows, the same ones she had opened in Arthur's room months ago, and held the paper up to the light. My lords, if you would please look closely. At the watermark the trustees rose, crowding around her. Lord Grantham peered at the paper. It is the mark of the Penworth Mill, Clara said, her voice ringing with the clear, cold certainty of truth. A stylized sheaf of wheat. But the Penworth Mill suffered a fire 2 years ago. When they rebuilt, they changed their watermark to honor the family who helped finance the reconstruction. They added a small crown above the wheat. She picked up a sheet from a different ledger, one of Finch's more recent forgeries. As you can see here, she looked directly at Finch, whose face had gone a dead, pasty white. This bill of sale, she said, holding up the first sheet, is dated 3 years ago. But it is printed on paper that according to its own watermark was not manufactured until last year. Silence. Absolute, damning silence. She had not proven her innocence. She had proven his guilt, with a single, unarguable fact. Finch stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He was ruined, and he knew it. Then, a small sound from the doorway. Everyone turned. Arthur stood there, his small face pale, his eyes wide. He must have slipped away from Mrs. Davies. He had heard everything. Lord Grantham looked at his grandson, his stern face softening. Arthur, he said gently, you should not be here, but since you are, tell me, has this woman, Miss Thorne, been kind to you? The boy looked at his grandfather. He looked at his aunt Augusta, whose face was a mask of horrified disbelief. He looked at his father, who was watching him with his heart in his eyes. Then he walked, his small shoes making no sound on the thick carpet, straight past his family, past the trustees. He walked until he was standing beside Clara. He reached up and took her hand, his small fingers closing tightly around hers. He looked up at Lord Grantham, and his voice, no longer a whisper, but clear and strong as a bell, filled the room. She taught me the stars," he said. "It was everything. It was the only testimony that mattered. The spell was broken." The room breathed again. Augusta let out a small, choked sob, the sound of her entire world collapsing. Nathaniel stood up, his face transformed. The cold, guarded Duke was gone, replaced by a man filled with a fierce, burning pride. "A Mr. Finch will be dealt with by the law," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. My sister will be returning to her own home this afternoon to contemplate the damage misplaced loyalty has caused." He looked around the room, at the stunned faces of the trustees. Then his gaze landed on Clara, and his expression softened into something no one in that room had ever seen from him before. It was wonder. It was reverence. "Anne and Miss Thorne," he declared, his voice full of a new, unshakable warmth. The heart of this house. She is its future. She is the future Duchess of Blackmore." That night, the house was quiet. The trustees were gone. Augusta was gone. Finch was in the custody of the local magistrate. The war was over. Nathaniel found Clara in the library, standing before the fire, just as he had been the day they first met. She looked tired, but she stood tall, a figure of quiet, unshakable strength. He came to stand beside her, the silence between them, comfortable, easy. "I told my staff you would be gone by spring," he said, his voice low and full of a deep, aching regret. "I know," she whispered. "I heard the maids talking. I was a fool," he said, "a blind, arrogant fool, locked in my own grief. I was the one who was gone. Clara, lost in this cold house, in this cold life. You taught me the stars too." She turned to look at him, her eyes searching his. "Do not say these things if it is only gratitude, Nathaniel. I do not want to be a reward for a service rendered." He reached out and took her hands, his grip warm and firm. "A gratitude is what I feel for my son's voice. Gratitude is what I feel for seeing Finch exposed. What I feel for you." He shook his head, struggling for the words. It has no name, I know. It is the feeling of coming home after a lifetime in exile. It is the feeling of breathing again after years of holding my breath. If that is gratitude, then it is a kind I have never known." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of profound, humble devotion. "I love you, Clara Thorne, not because you saved my house, but because you saved me from it, and from myself." A tears she had refused to shed in poverty and despair now welled in her eyes, tears of a joy so vast it was painful. "I stayed," she whispered, her voice thick. Because I could not imagine leaving. I think, I have loved you since you agreed I should not have to eat with the servants." He laughed, a real warm sound that filled the dusty library with life. Then I am a fool, twice over, for not seeing it sooner." It was the end of winter. A few days later, he announced he had to travel to London on urgent business. For a fleeting second, she felt a flicker of the old fear of being left. He saw it instantly in her eyes. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "I am the one who is leaving this time," he said softly, his gray eyes full of a light she had put there, but only for a few days, and only to find a ring worthy of the woman who stayed. A spring came to Blackmore, not as a deadline, but as a beginning. The sun poured through the clean windows, falling on floors where a small boy's footsteps now ran and echoed with laughter. The gardens were filled with the first green shoots of new life. The portrait of the late Duchess still hung in the library, her memory now a gentle, peaceful presence, not a haunting one. Clara, now the Duchess of Blackmore, stood by the window in the nursery, watching Arthur sail a small, perfectly rigged model ship in a basin of water. The sunlight caught the diamond on her finger, a star of impossible brightness. Nathaniel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. The house was warm. It was alive. It was a home. They had said she would be gone by spring. She was still there, and she would stay. Have you ever felt underestimated, only to find your hidden strengths were the key to everything? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what your favorite part of Clara's story was. We hope this story warmed your heart. If it did, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more stories of love, courage, and unexpected, happily ever afters. We love reading your comments and hearing how our stories touch your lives. We look forward to sharing another story with you very soon.